Welcome, everybody. We're going to be discussing an interesting topic today, fracking issues in Alberta and environmental impact. And the reason we're discussing this is the water issue and tailing ponds in Fort McMurray have been brought to the front about Alberta government allowing these tailing ponds that are treated to be dumped into the Athabasca River and sent to Ottawa as a present or a gift to Ottawa. Is this something that should be allowed? And then the other issue is fracking causes earthquakes, and Alberta has an on average of 165 earthquakes annually. And if you've ever experienced an earthquake in Alberta, it sure feels funny when the ground shakes under you. I've had that experience a couple times in my life, and it's pretty eerie feeling. And this can all be related back to the fracking issues in Alberta, but fracking occurs all around the world, folks, so we thought this might be an interesting topic. Cal, can you enlighten us on some of this issue?
Well, the reason oil reserves are fracked, often it's just shale, and quite often it's coal seams. So what happens is they drill a hole, a well, into the shale. Then they inject high pressure fluids that contain spacing material such as sand, crack the rock, the shale. The sand keeps the cracks open. The oil then accumulates, drips down into the vertical drilling, and comes out of the horizontal pipe. So it's a fairly complex procedure. It's done all over the world, as Cory said, but it depends on the rock formation. For example, in Michigan, they've banned, well, they haven't banned it, but they have less fracking. In Ontario, it's been banned. In Pennsylvania, they've got, as of 2024, over 221,000 drilled and proposed wells, and 14,380 of them are considered unconventional, which will be fracked. So in Pennsylvania, they've got a horrible environmental problem coming up. And Cory, you can give a little bit of the environmental issues.
Yeah, the environmental issues are a very interesting topic. When you're talking fracking, you've got an issue with using fresh water for the purpose of injecting down well. There's some farmers in the Rimbey area really concerned about this because their groundwater is even drying up, and they're afraid of contamination of groundwater for watering their cattle, and they've already made allegations that they've had to ship out some of their cattle herds, reduce their size due to lack of water. These are direct environmental impacts that are, I don't know how you describe it, but the blind eye is turned on these environmental impacts with the oil and gas industry in Alberta. Now, a little history, folks. I worked in the habitat protection branch of Fish and Wildlife in central Alberta back in my younger days. I had the opportunity of seeing firsthand how the government whitewashes and hides environmental impacts in the oil industry right across the province. And this hasn't changed over the decades because the same government and the same people are in power. They're just dealing with the environmentalists a little differently these days. And we'll get into other issues of environmental impacts in other episodes. What I want to concentrate on here is that fracking is a very impactful means of getting hard access oil and gas out of formations. And they use directional charges downhole to perforate the zones. Then under high pressure, they pump chemicals and sand to hold those cracks in the formation open. And when you realize that these cracks are formed by explosives or high pressure, you have to understand that rock under pressure can crack even further. And you got to realize that there's a lot of weight above these zones, which creates pressure on the zone. So when you create a vacuum in a formation by removing all the oil and gas, which is pressurized and holds the formation tight to prevent earthquakes, you're going to start seeing a lot of earthquakes in areas where fracking is done. And this has been the case. And my biggest issue is that we don't understand over time the impacts of fracking. Because of the cracks in the rock formation, we have an issue that might show its head 100 years from now where a well was fracked, and those cracks in the rock over time expand because there's a vacant space below them, and this pressurization causes the chemicals and fluids in that formation to leak into the adjoining formation above it, and then we start getting impacts where water is finding its way into those new formations, and with that contaminated water of the zone, we start seeing groundwater contamination. So it's a big issue for us, especially in Alberta, where we know the government has been negligent in protecting our environment for decades now, if not over half a century. And we have to start paying attention because these earthquakes are one of the side effects of this fracking issue. You said that Ontario banned fracking?
Yes, one of the things that Ontario is a little bit different than Alberta. The oil and gas sector is not nearly as large in the oil drilling area, and they still use a ancient technology in Ontario. It's a cable rig. The resources are shallow enough that they can actually use a bit, which is a cylinder with a weight and a sort of a chiseled end on it. They lift it up with a cable and drop it down 1 inch at a time until they hammer down, a couple of hundred or 1,000 feet. But they're not into shale. What they're looking for is resources that,
Reformation?
yes, the reformations are the ones that they want to find. Some of the inclines still contain oil. They're harder to discover and they don't contain as much. But it's not a shale extraction and it's not a coal extraction. Whereas in Alberta, you have hundreds and hundreds of miles of shallow, vertically, horizontally drilled wells that are very close to the surface. And of course, they have a great danger to the groundwater, and they have a great danger of leaking methane to the surface. So it's a huge problem in Alberta. It's going to become a disaster, in my opinion, in Pennsylvania. But it's something
Well,
that people need to look at.
well, one of the interesting things for you rig pigs here in Alberta, you ought to go see one of these cable rigs. It's ancient technology, and it looks like a real interesting operation that they're running to drill these wells. As a former rig hand, it was like, wow, they still use this? Holy, we could get this done in a couple hours compared to what they're doing. But it is effective technology, I guess, and you really want to have an eye-opener. Go to Ontario and look at one of these cable rigging and see some of the state-of-the-art rigs we use now, where we have top drive and all this sort of stuff that wasn't even there when I was working rigs in my youth. I went working rigs when I was 17, and we weren't allowed to because we're underage. We had to lie about our age to get the high-paying jobs. And it used to be a joke that you could tell a rig hand because he would be minus a digit or two on his hands. And that was old technology, that the rigs were unsafe. Now the rigs are a lot safer, although there's still many accidents. It's very impactful. But you take a look at one of those cable rigs and you go, holy jumping. I'm surprised they're allowed, and they look pretty dangerous too.
One of the reasons that some of the reasons that they give for still using cable rigs are that the technology here is proven. The rig itself weighs a lot less than a modern rig.
Yeah.
It's easier to move, and you're not ruining the roadways. and apparently the type of hole that's produced is significantly improved for this type of formation in southern Ontario. So they do have reasons for doing it. Not only that, it takes 3 weeks instead of 3 days and continues to
Yeah,
employ people.
job creation. Got
Yes.
to make money for the
Yeah,
workers.
it's interesting. They tie a ribbon to the cable. So they measure how much progress they've made by how far the ribbon goes down the hole. Like it's quite
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. Well, you rig pigs, you got to come out to Ontario sometime and go have a look at Oil City Petrolia there and see some of these cable rigs and the effects, and that wells still can produce hundreds of years after they've been drilled. So back to the
And
hydraulic fracking issues, the environmental impact that the Alberta government needs to consider is that all these tailing ponds, I mean, they're treated water in the tailing ponds in Fort Mac, but there's huge volumes of it that they wish to dump into the Athabasca River. My biggest concern and issue with the Alberta government is they're not looking at the bigger picture. If you're polluting the water, somebody downstream is going to be affected, and they can't guarantee that all the trace elements in the water from the tailing ponds isn't going to infect the fish and the wildlife there, and we end up eating it and being contaminated meat. The perfect solution is to take these tailing pond waters and force the industry to ship them to use that water in the fracking operations all across the province and all across Western Canada, because these tailing ponds would not be using fresh water per se. I mean, they get rainwater and stuff into them, but they would be a lot better use of that water is to dump it down the hole than to dump it into drinking water systems and heading it to Ottawa. I know they don't like Ottawa out here, and they want to send as much contaminants that way as they can, and they'll use the notwithstanding clause to make sure it happens. But this is the difference between crown corporations running your oil industry and private business for profit. Private business for profit does not want to have the added cost of shipping tailing pond water to their drilling operations in, say, Grand Prairie or Fox Creek or southern Alberta. And that shouldn't be the case. Had it been a crown corporation, it's in the best interest of Canadians, and we would save money over the long run, 100 years, 200 years down the road, by using this contaminated tailing pond water instead of our fresh water to put down the hole. The farmer at Rimbey would love it if this tailing pond water was mandatory to be shipped to Rimbey area and used in the fracking wells there. And this is an important issue, that contaminated waters from the drilling processes should be used to clean up the environment and not cause further environmental damages. You have more knowledge, I think, in the environmental aspects than most people, because you worked for oil company that dealt with some environmental issues where you guys bought some oil wells, apparently.
Well, there's some interesting regulations in Ontario and in Michigan that are slightly different than what you would normally find, especially in Alberta. For example, if you buy an oil resource in Michigan, one that's been in operation, say, for 10, 15, 20, 50 years and has gone out of business, gone bankrupt, or has quit producing because the technology wasn't there to make it profitable, they do what's called a phase one environmental assessment. And phase one environmental assessments are pretty standard across North America. Basically, it's take a picture, do some survey as to historical uses, don't dig samples, and don't do any rigorous testing, but just look around to see what is obvious. In Michigan, if you do a phase one environmental study, when you leave the site, when you're finished, you're only responsible to put it back into the condition of the phase one environmental study. So, for example, if the phase one study found a holding pond, like a tar sands waste pond, you wouldn't be responsible for cleaning that up because it existed when you took over the facility, which enhanced a lot of dead sites in Michigan that had been abandoned by industry over the last 100 years. However, it's pushing the problem down the road. So it's an interesting issue. Like, where does the environment protection come in to actually protect the environment, and where does the environment protection actually protect the producer of the actual pollution?
And this is going to be the issue that's going to manifest in Alberta sooner than later, because we have a long drilling history and oil field industry that has been negligent with its environmental issues and concerns, which boils down to your abandoned well programs. But it's even more than that, folks, because we have these tailing ponds and we have well site reclamations that were treated on site and then buried. So we have a whole bunch of issues that have gone silent because they were never exposed by the media, and they're not dealt with by the government because the industry feeds the government to get the politicians elected. So again, I point that, we should be modeling after Norway, because these future environmental impacts like earthquakes can be very devastating. If the right formations are fracked and they have an earthquake, let's say under the city of Grand Prairie or close enough to the city of Grand Prairie, it could cause building shifting, fires in the buildings by breaking gas pipelines, cracking CO2 lines, causing asphyxiation from not getting oxygen to people. There's all sorts of ways that an earthquake can really disrupt an area and cause harm. And it may not happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, but these issues are kicked down the road and become an issue that it could be very, very costly. So the only way we can recoup these future costs that we know are going to happen is to either tax the industry really where it should be taxed, about 80% of profits instead of the low 20s where it's at now, and a lot of write-offs, so a lot of companies pay nothing in taxes. And we got to quit the corporate welfare for these corporations, because they're not crown companies. They're not making us taxpayers wealthier. They're making us broke and higher taxes in the future. So Norway model, yeah, the industry fought and didn't like it. Alberta tried it with the National Energy Program. The industry fought the government, and they were able to pitch Alberta against Ottawa to destroy the National Energy Program. We lost $3-4 trillion and have all the economic impacts that we're going to have to pay for, like earthquakes and cracked lines, or who knows, contaminated groundwater, to these tailing ponds issues. We have to deal with it out of taxpayer money, and we're not compensated by the corporate piranhas that have come here and taken all the money offshore. So when we're dealing with these long-term fracking issues and the tailing ponds issues, they're best dealt with crown corporations that would be making the money from the production of the oil, which goes back to eventually there's going to be no oil to produce anyway, and we're going to be stuck with the bills. So I think this is an issue that's worth talking about and dealing with. The fracking has to be dealt with properly.
Well, as an example, according to Environmental Defense, as of 2020, the total volume of tailing ponds was estimated at 1.4 trillion liters. Now it's hard to imagine what a liter is, let alone 1.4 trillion of them, but it's apparently the equivalent of 560 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
Yeah.
So
a lot of water, and
it covers over 100 square kilometers apparently. What's the depth? How do you figure that out, right? So it's an interesting problem.
Well, I did some cleanups on oil rigs when I was 18, 19 years old, and they would treat it with activated charcoal to knock the particulates out of the water, and then they just pump it off into the bush. And everywhere that you go in the north, you'll see in August, mid-August, poplar trees changing their leaves in certain areas, and there's no leaf change next to them. Folks, that's contaminated water that was pumped out by some oil company in some treatment. And you could see it spotted all over the North Country. And yes, folks, I was working for a company that did that, and I didn't know that it was going to be that way and impacting the environment, but I do know now because I've seen the after effects. I know where we had operated, and I've seen the leaves change color month before they should. So there are environmental impacts. Hopefully over time this is cleaned up. You won't notice it probably 50 years from now, but because the soil does get rid of some of the contamination over time. But these issues are very important for us to consider when we're talking the industry as a whole. And it is a declining industry, folks. It means all the easy oil and easy gas are taken first. And that means the production of the other assets are going to be more costly, have more impact on the environment, and there might not be the revenue there to cover the cost of cleanup and future damages like an earthquake in a major center could cause. So we have to look at the economics, and the Alberta government does not look at the economics. They look at, can I get reelected? Can I run the province? And what do I get for a job after I'm out of politics? And that's the graft of the system right now. And you environmentalists, you should be getting online and helping us by subscribing and liking to our channel and spreading the word. You know, we're here to discuss and inform you, and we're more than willing to talk on issues that no other politicians will ever talk to you about, and no other people will stand up with the knowledge that we have from being insiders in the industry to let you know that there's some significant wrongs being done in Alberta, and you keep allowing it, the voters of Alberta, and that's not acceptable by any means.
Another issue that, doesn't, people forget quite readily if it's not in the news, but there was a Dr. John O'Connor who was the physician for the McKay Indian band in Fort Chipewyan, which is downstream from the oil sands. And he noticed that there was an increase in a elevated cancer rates, and raised the alarm that saying that the toxins were leaking out of the surrounding land and water systems, and were poisoning the residents. So the claim was later supported by a study partially funded by Health Canada. Yet all of a sudden his employment was terminated, and they wouldn't give him a reason as to why they terminated his employment. And then all of a sudden, they started to charge him with all kinds of things like billing irregularities. They said he had no authority to speak or to represent the health board. They went after him. And
yes, they do
what,
silence anybody exposing their corruption and their wrongdoings in the oil industry. They do go after people. They will target people. It's just like me being blacklisted in the Saskatchewan oil industry for exposing corruption with the land banking of oil rights and getting us screwed out of 245,000 acres of oil rights that we had won legally, and we can't even get it before the courts because of the corruption in the industry. And this happens, folks. And this poor doctor, all he was doing was saying, hey, this is poisoning, it's intentional. The tailings ponds do have an impact downstream, and because of the racism built around, oh, it's just a native reserve, give your heads a shake, folks. Doesn't matter who it is. Further downstream, other people were affected and are still being affected. So
well,
we need to...
Health Canada went after him and said that he was engendering mistrust, blocking access to files, billing irregularities, and raising undue alarm in the community. The professional misconduct charges obviously threatened his medical license, and
Yeah,
the Alberta
federally,
College of
that would have
Physicians.
been a conservative government at the time. and I do believe, but it doesn't matter which government it is. All governments in Canada are influenced by big oil money, and to say they're not is a lie. There's so much money passed around, and we will do some article on that, I'm sure, in the future, but this corruption where big corporations influence political decisions, and anybody speaking out against these political decisions is silenced or prevented from having a voice and defamed in the public is wrong. This defamation and use of political groups, like even the Law Society, defames people, and they have no recourse if they speak out against wrongdoings in the Law Society. I've seen firsthand some of the wrongdoings, and I've been silenced too. So this is a problem in politics when money buys politicians, which is Reaganomics. And that's where Reaganomics has really impacted pseudo-democracies around the world. And it's time we had revamping of what we see as what true democracy is to prevent these impacts on health. There's no way that tailings ponds isn't a health problem when released waters get into drinking water supplies, they get into fish supplies, and people eat the fish and are contaminated, which is, remember we did the article on the toxics being leached into the Battle River system from, you know, mercury to all sorts of contaminants from the hospital at Ponoka, and yet nothing was ever done. Polyev is in power. He's in the riding of Battle River. Not one step has been done to deal with that issue that we brought out in our episode. And this becomes a real concern that even when you bring out the facts that this is a ongoing issue, healthcare and pollution, nothing is done in Alberta or federally to deal with it. And that's a problem that has to be dealt with eventually, or we're going to get the bills for it down the road with higher health care costs, and we're going to be stuck with a big cleanup bills down the road. And we're not talking hundreds of billions. We're probably talking, you know, closer to $1 trillion 50 years from now when the impacts are going to be felt the most.
Back to Dr. O'Connor, he got cleared of the charges of billing irregularities, blocking access to files, but the charge of raising undue alarm in the community went, I guess, to a hearing, and the people of Fort Chip basically said nobody consulted us to see if we were alarmed. So the doctor was accused of creating undue alarm, and the residents are going, no, we weren't alarmed. We were happy that somebody identified the cause of our illness, and they were appalled that the federal government would actually go after somebody instead of solving the problem. They went after the person who disclosed the problem. Eventually, the doctor was cleared of the charges. However, it's like everything else. Once you've been charged by a professional association like that, it follows you for the rest of your career. So it's an interesting thought that the idea that if the oil sands were in fact causing this, the discharges from the oil sands, that the cleanup bill would have been astronomical. Even to treat the illnesses would increase the cost of production of the oil sands. Canada is a petrodollar. Value of the Canadian dollar is dependent on our oil exports, and a majority of them are now coming from the oil sands. So it was a huge
taxed oil producing region in the world, and that means we're not making enough money to cover these catastrophes and impacts to our health that the oil industry is causing, and we know it's causing it, and it's only going to get worse if we don't deal with the issues, right? So folks, wake up, smell the coffee. These are real facts. And just because our governments federally and provincially want to hide and prosecute people from speaking out against these wrongdoings, doesn't matter. You're going to pay the price down the road because your taxes are going to go through the roof because you aren't paying attention to the real facts. You're just paying attention to being gaslighted. Start digging into the real facts, folks.
On that note, I'm glad they're not fracking in my neighborhood.
Well, I got to deal with, the earth shaking under my feet, little earthquakes here and there. 165 annual earthquakes. That's probably only going to get worse over time. There's more wells. I mean, there's, 100 and some thousand wells, couple 100,000 wells being drilled across the province of Alberta. That's going to have some effect somewhere, and we're starting to see those effects. And that's the point, folks, is as more activity and time goes by, we're going to see the real environmental impacts that are going to be very, 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 very costly for us, the taxpayer, to foot the bill of. So when we're not getting fair market prices for our oil, we're not getting top dollar for our refining, which we don't have a very big refining industry here. We should be shipping refined products around the world and not contaminated heavy oil with sand particles to be dealt with effectively in countries that have no environmental regulations. This is a problem, and when you start looking into it more, you start seeing that it's going to be you, the taxpayer, paying for it. On that note, share, like, let us know what more in-depth in the oil and gas industry topics you'd like us to deal with. I'm sure there are quite a few, like how many people die annually in the oil field in Alberta. I think you'd be surprised, and they hide that from you. So take care.
Yep. And pass it on.
Yeah.
Good day.
Bye.
Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and please share the video. Don't be afraid to share this commercial with your friends too.